Hello and welcome to the latest of our podcasts on the situation with the cost of living. And I'm pleased to say that Hannah and I have been joined by Rachel, who's going to give us some insights that she's gleaned from our new brand dimensions data, which is tracking transactions effectively in real time through their debit cards, so we can actually start to see who is being impacted and who is changing their spend patterns. So, welcome, Rachel. Thanks for coming back. Um, let's start with socialising, and I think yeah, we saw Christmas. Everyone obviously went out and enjoyed themselves, but yeah, we're well into the new year now. What are you seeing, and has that been affected by cost of living, do you think?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that I've looked at. I've used a couple of case studies of different categories and different brands to have a look at what people have done in January and February, essentially. So first thing we looked at was Flight Club. So looking at that competitive socialising element. So what we saw with Flight Club, it's actually done pretty well in terms of maintaining its level of engagement of customers. So people are still wanting to go out and do things like competitive socializing, and we've seen brands generally do quite well in this space. A lot of new openings over the back end of last year and the start of this year as well. So I guess a category that's kind of got everyone's excitement going. But yeah, they seem to have done pretty well. The one thing that is quite interesting is that the way people are interacting with those spaces has changed a little bit. So for Flight Club, for example, we're seeing they've maintained really strong engagement, but actually the ATVs, the transaction values, when people are going, are dropping off, which means that potentially people are going to play darts at Flight Club, for example, but not necessarily eating and drinking there at the same time due to the added cost of that. So that'd be an interesting one to track going forward as well. We've also seen that the growth that they've had is due mainly through to online sales. So that's people booking in advance and booking spaces in advance rather than necessarily paying for food and drink at the time. So that's the first kind of sector we looked into. In terms of pubs and bars, we obviously know December was really strong for pubs and bars. It always is, but particularly the end of last year, it's the first year COVID-free Christmas in a long time, and obviously things like the World Cup impacted strong performance for pubs. What we have seen, however, in January and also going into February is that sales are lower in pubs and bars than they were last year. This really is showing that people are starting to cut back a little bit in terms of socializing than what we saw last year, and potentially trying to save money by not having those trips and potentially seeing their friends at home, for example, instead. So let's hope that people are just saving money in January and February, and then as we come into summer, people are returning back to pubs and bars as they were at the end of last year. I think it's probably more aligned to January and February trends and lifestyle rather than necessarily kind of this pattern might not happen for the rest of the year. We'll have to see.
Yeah, I guess it's a difficult one to compare against because it was a funny period, January last year, that we had the
Yeah,
back end of
exactly.
Omicron, but also people just wanting to get out and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so City Sophisticates in January actually worked this year actually quite strong within pubs. So they do seem to be the Acon group that generally you're not going to get them away from socializing and spending money in pubs and bars, they they are still impacted by the cost of living as well, but their priorities are just slightly different in their life stage. And then the last one is the last case that I looked at was Francomanca. So Francomanca is a really interesting one. It's obviously done so well over the last few years. A lot of new branches opening. It has a really unique proposition, I guess, across the country because it's low price point, but you can still go for a really nice meal. So in a crisis like this, has a perfect USP for consumers. And what they did in January is they offered £5 pizza, and you could go up to, I think it was like 3 or 4 times. So that essentially would help consumers go there more often. And we've really seen this in the data. So I'm going to share the dashboard with you to show you the impact that it had. So this is Frank & Manca's average transaction value over the last year. So you can see that over the course of the last year, it has started growing as food prices and inflation has increased. We'd expect that to increase. But in January, it essentially falls off a cliff again. So it goes back to levels as it was at the start of last year. But when we change this to look at the actual spend over this time, Frank & Manca has be able to maintain the amount of sales that it would normally expect in a month, which shows that offers such as £5 pizza, although it does affect transaction values, is going to positively impact your market share, because people are going to come more frequently, for example, and are more engaged with the brand, essentially. So that's a really good example of how a brand's done really well and used the situation to encourage visitation more.
Okay, thanks for that. That's really interesting. And anything else you're seeing in the sort of leisure space, or should we head to the world of retail?
Let's head to the world of retail. There's some interesting things going on there too. So looking at how different categories have performed over last year, we've actually seen retail hold up quite strong. Categories such as department stores and fashion, we're not seeing significant growth in these categories, but they're definitely in a similar place to where they were this time last year. So that is positive for the retail sector, definitely. Categories such as accessories and then also jewelry haven't seen that maintenance of spend versus last year, and I think that's probably just the additional purchase that people are potentially stepping back on compared to where they were, what they would have done previously. So yeah, thought that was a good thing that's sort of happened in January and February, that people are still going out to spend. However, within that, there's a lot of shift in terms of the brands that people are interacting with. So the most interesting one is, and we've all been interested in watching this for the last year, a brand that we've all been interested to track over the last year has been Vinted. So Vinted overtook ASOS in terms of transactions, so interactions with the brand, in summer last year. Not surprising, because there's very low transaction values and very high frequency and engagement with that brand. The transaction values in Vinted are only £10 versus that of ASOS, which is £35. So you can see why it's an attractive proposition to switch, especially for some clothing or kids clothing and stuff like that. It's a really good way to save money but still get an outfit for an event or other things as well. What's really interesting is starting to track that market share now. So ASOS market share is 7.1%. So that's ASOS's market share of the fashion category, and Vinted is now at 6.7%. So I don't think it's going to be too long before Vinted is bigger than ASOS in terms of market share. And that really shows that trying to save money point that consumers do have. They can get more for their money. Yes, it is secondhand, but it doesn't necessarily last less time, and it still serves the same purpose.
It's quite a remarkable shift on a brand that, not so long ago people have just never heard of. So that's a real switch in people's behaviours.
Yeah, and then with more of the offline brands, so high street brands, we've seen low value brands such as Primark and Peacocks grow their market share over the last year, showing that people are looking to spend less money in terms of first-hand clothing, essentially. But other brands that are a lot more luxury have also done well, but specifically in-store sales, not online. So you've got your Reiss, Calvin Klein, Ted Baker, Levi's, all showing growth in market share, which is positive because people are still treating themselves, but they want to do it in store with the experience. So they're paying a lot of money for something. They want to go and try it on. They want to have the store experience. They want to have the customer experience. So for brands, it's really important to maintain that level of customer service and experience within stores, and then people will spend there.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for those insights. And Hannah, you've been looking at at wellness, which was something that was raised at the end of the last webinar. What have you been looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. We were definitely interested in looking at how health and wellness had translated through. Obviously, we saw that consumers were particularly enthusiastic about growing their use of health and wellness. But what I was really curious in was seeing if brand dimensions actually reflected that behaviour coming through. So the first place I started was the ONS basket of goods, which is essentially a basket of goods that reflects what UK consumers are buying, and they use it for various things, including inflation metrics and that kind of thing. But it's a really good reflection of where people are spending their money. And what I first looked at is what's come out of the basket and what's gone into the basket, and it felt in tune with what consumers were saying. So what we saw go into that basket was frozen berries, electric bikes, and green beans, all of which point towards a healthier way of living. And what actually came out were Alka Pops, 2 specific bottles of red wine, and 1 packet of cigarettes. So that felt really indicative of the fact that people are potentially trying to live better lives this year and spending the money that they have left on better things. Now, that then took me to brand dimensions to look to see if we had any behaviours that reflected any of this. And first of all, looking at gyms, we saw a really strong gym performance in January. Now, we normally see a big jump in gym use in January anyway. That's followed through the last couple of years. People's New Year's resolutions, people having drank too much over Christmas and trying to kind of clean themselves up a bit in January. But we definitely saw that come through. And 2 particular gyms that stood out as having particularly strong Januaries and Februaries were F45 and One Rebel, who have both been particularly successful in the likes of London and other cities. They're kind of rolling out to border areas as well. But particularly the city sophisticates engaging with those brands and actually really propping them up. Next, I looked at salons and spas, and we saw really good spend again across Headmasters, Tony and Guy, and others, both growing their market shares by nearly a percentage point, which is particularly interesting in January, given that, of course, we've seen pubs not do as well. So where people are choosing to spend that limited disposable income they've got, looks like it's being directed more towards those areas, which again reinforces our initial hypothesis that health and wellness are going to have a good quarter at least. And then finally, and this links back to the point that Rachel made on retail, you were talking about the low value brands doing well, but also some of those high value brands doing well. We've seen that in the beauty space too. So Savers and Superdrug growing their market shares this quarter already. But then also the likes of Le Labo, that in-store luxury purchase, also gaining grounds. So yeah, a lot of evidence that actually health and wellness is a growing trend this year, and we're seeing more evidence to support that. Very interesting.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, really useful insights, and yeah, backs up some of what you're seeing there, Hannah, from the surveys before. So I think that wraps up what we've seen this month. Next month we are going to come back. Sue is going to be our guest presenter, and she's going to be talking about what we've seen from the budget that's now occurred and how potentially that's going to influence the landscape in the months ahead. And we'll also be talking about our new version of paycheck disposable income and seeing what insights we're getting from that now that we've rescaled local area incomes to reflect the rising inflation and the rising costs that we're seeing. And also glad to say that the electricity price or the energy price cap has been maintained, which will hopefully help people in those figures as we move forward and look at disposable incomes. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Rachel and Hannah, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks.
Thank you.